you have your Bibles with you this morning, turn them to the book of Ruth. We're in chapter 4 of Ruth. We've been walking through this really cool story, really beautiful story, great story. And today, as we come to chapter 4, we're really getting to the peak, the climactic moment of the whole story. Have you ever had to be rescued? Have you ever been in a situation where somebody had to rescue you, whether it be pull you out of something? Maybe for some of you, it was a life-saving thing, like someone literally saved your life by coming to your aid at a crucial time. I'll never forget the very first time that I had to be rescued. It was one of my earliest memories that I can think back as a kid. I was probably around 6 years old or so, and this memory is etched in my mind for a lot of different reasons. It was a really cool thing that we got to do, and then something that happened in that I'll just never, ever forget. And so at that time of the stage in our life, about 6 years old, my brother was 4 years old, our family was pretty poor at that time. And so we didn't get to do a lot of the extra fun things. We didn't travel a lot and get to do really neat things a whole lot. And Dad decided he was given an invitation to go hunt on someone's property over a weekend. And Dad planned this to be a father-son weekend hunting trip. But we had never got to do anything like this, so we are stoked about it. I mean, I can't sleep all week long. This is the opportunity to go hunting with Dad. And so Friday, he picks us up from school, and we head to this property. And the plan is that we're going to camp out there. They have this little cabin there, and we're going to stay. So that just added to the whole thing. Like we're out in the woods, just men getting to hunt. And in this cabin, when we show up to this property, and I don't really know the difference, but it's not a cabin. It's a shack. I mean, it's got plastic over the windows. There's no heat. All that you have is a cast iron stove inside this shack that will heat the place. And Dad can't seem to get it going. And so it's cold that weekend. So Stephen and I are really, really cold. It's getting to be evening time, and Dad's trying to get this fire warmed up. And no, now we're cool. We still think this is like the Taj Mahal. We think this is just awesome. But we begin to get cold, and I begin to shiver and get really cold, but I'm not going to complain. I don't want my complaints to ruin our great weekend. And so I go to my duffel bag, and I grab all the clothes that I brought for that weekend, and I put them all on. I'm going to be warm. Stephen did the same thing. We didn't say a word to Dad, but about an hour and a half later, Stephen is shivering uncontrollably. And Dad looks at this situation. He's got the fire going. It's not heating up it's heating up the world, but it's not heating up this cabin. And he realizes, we can't sleep here tonight. And so he says that. And of course, man, we begin to our eyes begin to well up, like our weekend has been ruined because we're not men and we can't handle this cold weather. And Dad says, don't worry, there's a town about 30 minutes away, and we'll drive there, and maybe they'll have a place to stay. Maybe they'll have a hotel. Well, man, our eyes perk up because we've never stayed in a hotel before. Wow, this just got so much better. So we go in, and we check into a motel. There is a difference between a hotel and motel, and one of the differences is the doors are on the inside versus the doors are on the outside. Well, this is the kind that the doors are on the outside. So we check in this motel, but we don't know the difference. We think it's awesome. I mean, they have a TV in it and all this kind of stuff. And in the courtyard of the motel, there is a pool. And so we're begging our dad for a few minutes, like, can we go see the pool? Can we go see the pool? So Dad lets us out. There's a screen window in the back that opens up into the courtyard that lets us out into the area where the pool is. And we're just fascinated by this pool. Now, obviously, we're not going to swim. I mean, it's like 35 degrees. We're not swimming, but we do want to check out the pool and, put our fingers in it and play around it and just do something. And Dad was probably by that point in time just sick of us for a moment, needed a break. So Stephen and I are out there walking, jogging, running, playing around the pool and so forth. And I'm over next to the deep end. And I'm leaning over, and I'm just circling my finger in it. And Stephen runs by me and just accidentally nudges me a little bit. And I fall into the pool with all my clothes on for the whole weekend. And this morning when I walked outside and it was 25 degrees, it reminded me of how cold it was and how cold it felt. I mean, I thought all of a sudden I am about to die of hypothermia. Man, I didn't know anything about hypothermia, but I just knew getting in the water with all your clothes on in cold weather was a really bad thing. So I'm sitting there, and the worst part about it, I don't know how to swim. I have no clue how to swim. I've never been taught how to swim. So I'm sitting there trying to just gasp for air, pull myself up as much as possible, trying to get to the edge, and I can't do it. And all of a sudden, my entire life flashes before my eyes, and I'm not going to get to hunt tomorrow, and I'm going to make Dad so mad, and I'm going to die, and all this. I mean, just all these bad thoughts that come through my mind when all of a sudden I hear a splash, and grabs me is my father, fully clothed. He had heard me screaming or heard my brother screaming, and he bolted through the screen door, came outside, jumped in the pool, grabbed me, and took me safely to the edge and pulled me out and then whipped my tail, okay? But saved my life. I'll never forget that life-saving. I wouldn't be here and be your pastor today had it not been for my dad to save my life in Woodville, Texas at the Motel 6 or whatever it was then. You know, all of us have been and need to be rescued. We find ourselves in situations and scenarios, whether it's a subtle one or whether it's something more severe and significant, where we need the aid and need the help of someone else. And spiritually speaking, every single one of us is in that condition. Born with sin, committing sin, we are enslaved and bound, and we need a rescue. In Ruth chapter 4, in a very beautiful way, there is a picture painted of a rescue. All throughout this story that we've been reading, as we met Naomi in chapter 1, with her and her husband and 2 boys head off to the land of Moab just to find food, to save themselves and find food, and then find themselves in a much worse predicament where Elimelech dies and the 2 sons of Naomi get married, but then they die. And now you have 3 widows that are mourning and grieving, left destitute. And you see at the end of chapter 1, Naomi makes the decision to go back home after 10 years with no husband and no sons. She heads back home, but yet intact with her is one of her daughter-in-laws, Ruth, who's also a widow. We end chapter 1 not knowing what we're going to see next. We see 2 grieving women. We see one who is incredibly depressed. In chapter 2, things begin to take shape and change a little bit as Ruth, this young widow that's attached herself to Naomi, goes out and begins to work and just happens upon the land of a person that is incredibly good to her by the name of Boaz. And Boaz blesses her, and Boaz takes care of her, and Boaz provides a whole lot of food for her and provision for her in the days ahead. And it's just a neat story how these 2 women who are so destitute find provision, and we see God's hand moving through that and through this man Boaz. But then at the end of chapter 2, there's a plan put together, because Naomi realizes that this man Boaz might have an obligation and might have an interest in her daughter-in-law, Ruth. And so she devises a plan for Ruth to approach Boaz to propose to him. And so chapter 3, things really tense up and get really serious as Ruth makes her way one evening to the threshing floor and in a very unique way makes a proposal to marriage to Boaz, to which Boaz replies, yes, but some things have to be worked out. I can't just marry you. I can't just redeem or rescue you. There is another family member, but I'm going to take care of it in the morning. Which finds us in chapter 4, the next morning, when the rescue begins to take shape. Would you draw your attention to chapter 4 of Ruth? Beginning reading in verse 1. I'm going to ask you to be seated because we're going to walk through this passage together and then draw some really important points for you and I. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. which is really unique. The next morning he gets up, as promised, and he just goes to the gate. The gate was, in those days and time, the place where serious meetings took place. If you had a serious meeting or a legal matter or something like that, or you had business to do, on the one hand, it would be like the way we say, hey, I'm going to meet you out back, which means we're going to deal with something here. But here it was more of a proposition or a legal matter where witnesses could gather. So he goes and waits at the gate, and he's waiting on this next kinsman, this nearest kinsman to Ruth and Naomi. So there he is, waiting at the gate. And behold, which is the second time we see this word. The first time we see this word, by the way, in this statement, is in chapter 2, verse 3, when Ruth comes to this land, and behold, it happens to be Boaz's land. And so here Boaz is waiting at the gate of Bethlehem, at the city gate of Bethlehem or Jerusalem, waiting for one in thousands of people to show up, and behold, it just so happens the Redeemer whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, hey, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And so he turned aside and sat down, and he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. And so they sat down as well. And then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Now, if you stop right there, you think, Boaz, what are you thinking? Boaz is apparently excited and lucky to be proposed by Naomi to him to marry her. I mean, this is a neat deal, and he calls it kindness, and so he's head over heels for this lady. But this plan almost shows us that it's falling apart. So everything has gone just as planned, so great in this whole proposal plan. But Boaz says there's just one problem. There's a nearest kinsman. I got to deal with that. And so Boaz goes to the gate. He does everything properly, everything right. He brings the elders. He brings witnesses. There's other people standing there. And we read in Old Testament law, you see there's several pictures of redemption that Boaz is fitting in this. Whenever a person was so poor that they had to sell their land to survive, we read in the book of Leviticus that it's an obligation and responsibility of the nearest family member to purchase that land and return it to the family member. And so clearly here we see in this story that that's taking place. Naomi, whose husband Elimelech had land, and she now possesses that land, is so poor, so destitute, that the only way that they're going to continue on as they look forward in the future is they're going to have to sell that land. And so a family member, the nearest family member, has the obligation to buy that land and return that land. We also see that this took place if a person got so poor and a family got so down that they had to sell themselves into slavery. Also, the obligation of the kinsman redeemer, the nearest family member, to take the opportunity to purchase that family's freedom, set them free. And then in Deuteronomy, we read of the law of Goel, which is the brother-in-law. And if a man's brother passes away without leaving children, it's the responsibility of that man's brother to take that widow as his own wife and carry on the name of his brother and also the inheritance for that next generation. And so all these things are taking place, and there's a process where you meet at the gate, you have the meeting, and you settle the matter there, the purchase of all this. So he does all this right. And Boaz is not the nearest kinsman redeemer. I mean, he's in love with Ruth, but he's not the closest one. So if he wants to do this right, he's got to go through the right process. You know, this guy, who all we know as the Redeemer, we don't know his name, clearly wasn't interested in it at this point. Because it's been several months now that Naomi's been back, and he hasn't taken a step forward. Maybe he's one of those guys who's just kind of hoping nobody notices and nobody asks, that everything works out. It's not something that's just drawn to his attention, so it's not like Boaz is fighting over it. And so he approaches him and says, hey, do you want to buy the land? Let's have this matter, and if you don't want to buy the land, then I'm happy to buy it. Well, the guy, for whatever reason, says, I'll buy it, which means Boaz just lost. And so his plan to take care of Naomi and Ruth has fallen short, and this other man has the opportunity to do it. And so he says, all right, redeem it, I'll redeem it. But then Boaz, I don't know if this was a last-minute thought or if this was his game plan all along. It's kind of crafty. And Boaz said, okay, well, the day that you buy it, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, verse 5, you will also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. I love how Boaz did that. It's almost like Boaz knew what he was doing and that he wanted to make sure this man's intentions with the land were the right intentions. And so he sells him on the land, but he says, okay, but there is an addendum to this land. There is something added to this land, and that means you get a wife. You have to marry this widow who is attached to the land and the inheritance because she's she's the widow of the son who's received the land as an inheritance, and so you have to marry her. So as long as you're good with that, we'll do the deal right now, which the guy begins to pump the brakes on this whole thing. Whoa, 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 whoa. The Redeemer said, whoa, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. I tell you what, why don't you go ahead and take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. That's a big time no. I don't know this woman, and if I do redeem, I could lose some. I have got a game plan. I've got a 10-year plan here, 20-year plan. I mean, this could mess all of that up. So I tell you what, you redeem it. And so Boaz does, and it tells us how Boaz goes about it. It was a custom that took place. In fact, if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, this custom is described in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Now, this was the custom in former times of Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this is the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, he drew off his sandal. And then Boaz said to the elders and the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Shelon and all that belonged to Mahlon, also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon. I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his brothers from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. Now, in all of our Disney fairy tales of people falling in love and getting married, I've never seen this sort of picture displayed in that. And I would imagine that those of you that are married, that in your wedding, there wasn't anything like this that necessarily took place. This was the wedding. That day when that shoe was taken off the foot of this guy and given to Boaz, and he forked over the money to buy the land, he was married at that moment to Ruth. What a beautiful picture. You know, that may actually be a good way to do it. I don't really know. But at that moment, through Boaz, God rescues Naomi and Ruth. You know, all throughout the history of Israel, there was this picture and this thought, this theme of redemption. It begins with really Israel's first stepping stone into the world as they were enslaved to Egypt and grew up and formed and expanded in slavery to Egypt. And it's under the reign of that Pharaoh that God led Moses to set his free people free. As Pharaoh refused to let them go, and God delivered his people. He redeemed his people. He bought back his people and brought them to safety. And we see this theme of redemption embedded, enshrined all over their stories, all over the Old Testament, as they continually praise God for the deliverance and praise God for the freedom, that they were captive and they were held and they were prisoners, but God intervened, redeemed, and set them free. And even in their law, God established that his own people should act in that manner. And so he establishes these redeeming laws, the Levirate marriage, the kinsman redeemer, these things that are taking place here in this story. God's people were to be people that delivered, that acted like God. And when their own family members found themselves in captivity and difficulty, they stepped in, they intervened, and they bought their freedom out. Now, the purpose of these laws was to preserve the name and protect the property of families of Israel. God owned the land, and God owned these people as for himself. He made them and called them his own, and he did not want them exploited by people who would take advantage of poor people and widows. And so these laws were set up to help those who were vulnerable and in situations they could not get out, because that's what God did for his people. These laws and what is taking place in this story, the laws behind it, really weren't so much about romance, but more about ensuring that families survived and about keeping the land God had promised to his people in the family. But there's something different about the Redeemer, Boaz. Though he follows the law, there is a love that drives him through the steps of obedience. You see, hundreds and hundreds of years before the Redeemer, Jesus Christ, came, God wanted us to know what we'd be getting, to give us a picture of the heart behind our redemption. And so here in this man Boaz, who, by the way, is an ancestor of the family of Jesus, is the DNA of our rescue. What is redemption? What does redemption mean? Well, it's a simple meaning, it's a simple concept. It's to pay a price to set someone free. Ruth and Naomi are at a difficult spot in their life. They're so poor, they're so destitute, that we see in verse 3 that they have to put their land up for sale. They cannot afford to live, and their land is going to go to another person. They can't afford, maybe they had a mortgage that they were behind upon. We don't really know the circumstance or situation behind this whole proposition here, but nonetheless, they were about to lose the land. And so if they lost the land, there would be no future for them raising crops. It was a farming community, and that was absolutely necessary. They were going to be on their own, and so a rescue was necessary. They were too poor to redeem the land themselves. And so at the end of the chapter 3, you have two widows unable to purchase their own freedom and get out of their situation, waiting on someone to rescue them. You and I are no different than Ruth and Naomi. You see, we too have something that we are way in over our heads with, that we can't buy ourselves out of, that not enough works, not enough effort, not enough praying, not enough planning, not enough money, not enough anything, not enough religion can get us out of the debt that we owe for our sin, the enslavement that we have to it, and the death that we'll face. We can't save we're enslaved to sin. Jesus said in John chapter 8 Verse 34, truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. You and I are enslaved by it. We're born with a sinful nature, and all of us have acted upon that sinful nature. And because we've acted upon that sin, we have been shackled by that sinful nature. And no matter how much good we do, we still have the sin lingering, the stain of sin upon us. And standing before a righteous and holy God, we cannot. And we can't make up for it. We can't cover it up. Not enough good works, not enough good thoughts and good things that we do is not going to make up for it. We're enslaved to it. We can't get it off of us. We need a rescue. We need help because we are all born headed straight to an eternity without God, hell, unless someone redeems us, rescues us. And so, driven by obedience to his Father and driven by love, Jesus Christ comes. And in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, we read, "For even the Son of Man came to give his life as a payment for many." You know, you don't have to look far to realize the bondage that we're living in. The habits and hang-ups that we can't get across, the fact that we just can't ever feel as though we're good enough. It drives us, and it's killing humanity today. The bondage and the enslavement. And some it comes out in a more visible way and in a way that can't be hidden. Some that come to a place and point where they realize they've been so bound by pleasing something and driving towards something, not being able to attain there. And so as a result of that, they fall into addictions. And they cannot get out of those addictions. We see some that fall into a place and point of depression, and they cannot get out of that depression. And today in our society and culture, there are more counselors, psychologists that people are dependent upon. There's more prescription medication that we're dependent upon because we're enslaved. Now, for some of us, we cover it up really, really well. We don't have those problems. We've got it together. Not realizing that we're still enslaved to sin, that it's lingering and lurking. And while we may not be a slave to alcohol or drugs or some sort of prescription or something like that, we're enslaved to success, we're enslaved to money, we're enslaved to acceptance, we're enslaved to proper popularity, we're enslaved to our pride. I mean, just add it and just name it. We're all enslaved, and the enslavement ultimately is a result of our sin. This world is striving, fighting, grinding. And when you boil it down, it's because we're wrapped, captured by our brokenness. And the good news of this book is this. John chapter 8, 36. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. He is our Redeemer. But not anyone can be a redeemer. There are certain marks. There are certain characteristics. We see that in this story, that there are certain things that are required for a person to redeem. Boaz had the intention, he had the desire, he wanted to redeem Ruth and rescue Ruth and Naomi from their situation, bring them into his family. But not anyone could do that. Not anyone could just redeem anyone. We're told in Leviticus chapter 25 that the obligation and responsibility of Redeemer is to the nearest kinsman. That was the problem for Boaz. He wasn't the nearest kinsman. Though he wanted to rescue her, he cared about her, he didn't have the right to do that because he was the nearest kinsman. He wasn't the nearest kinsman. He had to get closer. And to get closer, he had to make sure that the other kinsmen were removed and said no, so that he would then move into that slot. And so that's why in righteousness, he approaches this other guy. Hey, you're the nearest one. You have the responsibility. You have the obligation if you'll do it. But if you say no and you give me that shoe on your right foot, then I move into that position. You see, he had to get into a position to be closer to Ruth in order to redeem her. God has a love for us. God has compassion over our brokenness and our enslavement. But in order to redeem us, he had to get closer. And so he sent his son. He came through his son, Jesus, in flesh and in blood, so that he could be a close kinsman of ours to redeem us. The writer of Hebrews tells us about this in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14, when he says, "Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery." One of the marks of a Redeemer is that the Redeemer needed to be near. And our Redeemer got as near as possible, becoming man, bearing flesh, carrying all that upon himself, coming close, touching us with his hands, seeing with his own eyes, and having compassion with a real beating heart in this world. He came to us. The Word became flesh. Redemption came through the man, Jesus Christ. Not through some cosmic being above, but in flesh and blood. Another mark of Redeemer that we see here is that a price has to be paid. And in order to redeem a person, you have to be able to pay the price. And that's what Boaz proposes to this guy here in verse 4. I thought I'd tell you that. So Naomi's selling her land. If you want to redeem it, you got to pay it. You got to fork over the money. And the guy says, yeah, I can pay it. A price had to be paid. It doesn't matter Boaz's intentions. In order for Boaz to redeem Naomi and Ruth, he had to pay a price. He may have loved her. He may have cared about her. He may have wanted it. But if he didn't have the ability, the money needed, it wouldn't have mattered. Over 15 times in this chapter is the word purchase or buy. Because there cannot be redemption without paying a price. Friend, I want you to understand that when it comes to the price of your redemption, paying the cost of your sin, Christ, Jesus, is the only one who can afford it. That's why we worship him. We don't worship him because he's the best of many. We don't worship him because we think he's a better Messiah or Savior or God than any other. We worship him because he's the only one that can pay the price for our freedom. And he did. By his blood. Peter tells us in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 18 through 19, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but look at this at verse 19, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. There is nothing more valuable and priceless, really, as the blood of Jesus. Nothing is pure and is perfect. And he paid that price with his life to save us. He came close. He paid the price. And he was willing. It's one of the things that really, really is shocking in this story. Because everything almost derails in verse 5 or verse 4 when this near Redeemer says, yeah, I'll redeem it. I'll buy it. And all of a sudden, Boaz's plan and all of this preparation by Ruth and Naomi is about to completely be washed away. Because this man says he's willing to redeem the land. But then something flips, like last minute flip, as he throws this information out that, okay, you redeem this land, you also get Ruth, the widow of Mahlon, the deceased. And he immediately puts the brakes on. And you realize he's not willing to pay the price. That he's not really willing to go through with everything. While he wants the land, he doesn't want the person. While he wants the possessions, he doesn't want to take care of this human being and lose something of his. He wasn't willing. And that's where we see something unique with Boaz, who was willing. I'll do it. I can do it. I'm now the closest to it, and I'm willing to do it. And that's the beautiful thing about Jesus Christ. He can pay the price. He came close to do it, and he wants to. He wants to redeem you. He wants to rescue you. He wants to save you. He wants to pull you out of all that enslaves you. He wants to pull you out of the sin and the death. He wants to save you from eternity away from him in hell. He wants to pull you out of your addiction and out of your depression and out of this cycle of trying to be somebody to this world. He wants to rescue you and me, and he's willing to do it. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. Looking to Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21, he who knew no sin became sin so that we might become the righteousness of God. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 15, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. He came to redeem. And he wants to redeem you. A lot of people ask the question, how can such a loving God send people to hell? Well, friends, that's not the right question. You don't see the whole picture. The truth is, we have a loving God who's trying to rescue us all from hell. And sent his son to pay the price for anyone that would allow him to buy him. Jesus came to buy your freedom with his blood. Will you let him? There's a little boy named Tommy that got into a little hobby of building little boats, and so he crafted this little boat out of some scrap wood and worked on it really hard to make it float, put some sails on it. Once the project was complete, Tommy went down to the creek that was near his house and put the boat in the water to see if it would float. And sure enough, the boat floated. And so it began going along with the stream, the wind slightly catching the sail, and it began going along down the stream, and Tommy just began to walk by it, just so fascinated by this cool thing that he made, so proud of it. But as he reached down to grab it and pick it up, the boat hit a current, a swifter current, and it pushed it further down. So Tommy got up and ran down, and what was happening was the boat was going faster than he could keep up with it. And as the boat got further and further and further away, Tommy just kept running down that creek until he couldn't see the boat anymore. It was gone. A few days later, he was in town with his family, and at a secondhand store there in the square, in the window, he noticed something that looked a little bit familiar. And it caught his attention, so he got closer and closer, and the closer he got, he realized, that's my boat. It's for sale. So he goes into the store, and he finds the store owner. He says, hey, listen, I need my boat back. That's my boat. I made that boat. And the store owner is so confused by this little kid who's saying this thing, says to him, hey, whatever your story is, that's fine. If you want that boat, it's going to cost you $1. It's the price for the boat. Tommy didn't have $1. So he went home and he began to go through the couches, find all the change he could find, his dad's jacket when his dad wasn't looking, and he pulled together enough pennies and dimes and nickels to amount to 100 cents, $1. So the next time he was in town, just a few days later, he went into that store. He put all that change down on the counter, and he says, I want to buy my boat back. So the man counted the change. Sure enough, it was $1. And as Tommy walked outside of that shop, he held that boat to his chest. He looked at it and he said, twice you're mine. I made you. I bought you. God made you, and he loves you. He created you unique, wonderful, with a purpose and a plan. And by your sin and my sin, we've been lost. But he's paid the price to buy you back. Will you let him? By trusting in Jesus.